Welcome to the Atheist of Florida YouTube channel. We are pleased to offer some of the most significant speakers and profound issues of our times. If you like today's video, please hit the like button. If you have already subscribed, thank you. If not, you know what to do.
Okay, thanks everyone. Thanks Judy for inviting me back on to the Atheists of Florida. I'm really looking forward to this discussion. As we've been saying, it's really personal for me because I was raised not only in fundamentalist Christianity as a kid, but also, as she mentioned, the Bill Gothard Institute, and it was called Institute in Basic Youth Conflicts then. It's called Institute in Basic Life Principles now, even though he's been disgraced, the ministry, quote unquote, it's a cult. It continues on. And they have a big homeschooling arm and everything else. So I was raised in that environment. And so I've part of my journey of reconstruction of my authentic self was studying cult psychology. And that's what really led me into that whole field. Then I started talking to cult experts and it just kind of went from there. So yeah, I will share my PowerPoint now. Hopefully you can see all that. Can you see that?
Not yet.
Can you see it yet?
No.
Okay, hang on. Let me just go back to the call. Ah, right. Share screen. That would probably help.
Yes,
Yeah.
it
I can see it. I don't know what the problem is. I don't want to do like I did at the last presentation. You can now see that, I take it.
is. Yes, yes, we can.
Okay, good. So there's a lot of information in here. We're going to run through it. And then I think, was that right, Judy? We're going to have some Q&A time.
Yes,
Dialogue afterwards. So if
Yeah.
you think of any questions, just throw your comments down or put it. Well, I won't be able to see the chat. I'm not sure in there, but yes. So as you mentioned, I'm the host of the Mindshift podcast. This is a very personal journey for me. It was when I started watching documentaries about cults about 6 years ago, 5-6 years ago, that I realized that cult psychology, cult tactics massively resembled the very things I was raised in. And I said, wait a minute, I wasn't raised in a cult. I was raised in a church. Wait a minute, this is a lot stranger than it should be, so that's when I started this journey of sort of looking into cult psychology, cult tactics. So I'm sorry, I'm not trying to insult anyone, but I'm a teacher by trade. What you're taught to do is you lay out your learning outcomes at the beginning. So these are the things we're going to be covering. First of all, I want to see how much you know about cults in general. We'll show you some pictures to see if you can identify a cult leader. Then I want to talk about this question of who actually joins a cult, because that's a common misconception. How do people get into cults? And then evaluate the definitions of cults and explore. There's a load of different types of cults. And I will say now, when we look at the different types of cults, even though you might identify as an atheist, you could think, oh, I'm never going to get involved in a religion. But there's a lot of other different types of cults that people get involved in. In fact, there's a very good book by Amanda Montell. I've just finished reading it. It's called Cultish. And the premise of the book is basically that there's a lot of cult-ish things out there in our society that we can get involved in. So you may not be in a cult per se, like Scientology or Jehovah's Witnesses or something like that, but you could be involved in a cultish thing. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on. Then we want to look at some of the various elements of cult tactics and cult psychology, what the impact is on our personality, basically when we're involved in a cult. And then at the back end, I want to talk about resources for cult rescue and ex-cult recovery. So what do you do if someone is involved in a cult, or if you've come out of a cult, or as someone said, they've come out of a toxic religion or a toxic relationship? How do you start to rebuild your life? I want to give you some resources that have proven to be helpful for me and a lot of other people that I've spoken with who come out of cults and damaging religion and damaging relationships. So what I want to do is I want to test your knowledge of cults. Let's just see. This is kind of a pub quiz. Can you identify the cult leader I'm going to show on the screen? And bonus points if you can identify the cult group that they were a leader of. So who's this? Does anyone know who that is?
Charles
Manson, Charles Manson.
Okay, so what was the name of the cult that he led?
The Manson family, the
Yeah, so
family.
you had Charles Manson and he led the Manson family. Then you have another cult leader. Who's this? And I love
Jim-
this.
Jim
this-
Jones.
Yeah. And what was the cult that Jim Jones led?
The People's Temple?
Yeah, that was the name of the church that he led in, I think it was in Los Angeles, Southern California. What was the compound that he founded down in South America? Did anyone know?
People's Temple.
That was the name of his church. And then they moved.
Jonestown.
Yeah,
Jonestown.
Jonestown. So Jim
Excellent.
Jones, People's Temple,
Jonestown.
Jonestown. Then you've got this individual here. Who's this?
David Koresh.
Koresh.
David Koresh. What cult was he associated with?
The Branch Davidians.
Yeah, very good. So David Koresh, the Branch Davidians in Waco, Texas. Who's this then? This is another one you may not know.
The Moon's heir to
Some
the
might
moon.
think it's the Moonies, but it's not the Moonies.
No.
He did the
It's in the-
subway bombing.
Yes, that's the person. But who's his name and what was the cult that he led?
It's in Japan somewhere.
Yeah, it was a Japanese cult. All right.
Shinrikyo.
Yeah, Om Shinrikyo. That was the name of the cult. So he was called Shoko Asahara, and the cult he led was Om Shinrikyo. And then last,
Heaven's Gate.
Evans Gate was the cult. What was the name of the cult leader?
Don't remember.
Test your knowledge of
Oh.
cult.
Apple. Yeah, I think
Apple.
it's David Apple.
No,
David,
no,
no, that was
Oh.
close. It was Marshall Applewhite. The
Okay.
cult was Heaven's Gates out of San Diego. Now, the question is, looking at all these cult leaders, and this is just a small smattering of the many, many cult leaders we could put up here. What connects them together? And it goes back to the name of this presentation, Poison Punch and Purple Shrouds. What's that connection? Does anyone know what the connection is with the title of this presentation?
They committed suicide, and it was an apocalyptic sort
Yeah.
of cults. Like they said, "Oh, the end of the world's coming," kind of cults.
Yeah.
Well,
So the
Marshall Applewhite was the one who, wasn't he the one who believed that the aliens were in the trail of
the Hale Comet.
yeah,
Mhm.
Hale-Bopp
Mhm.
Comet.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
the Poison Punch comes from the Jim Jones, Jonestown. Almost 1,000 members committed suicide. Some were murdered by the cult group, but most of them drank the Flavor Aid. Although it's become popular, they say drink the Kool-Aid, but it was actually Flavor Aid. And then the Purple Shrouds, when the Heaven's Gate cult members committed suicide, they were covered in purple shrouds. And they all wore Nike shoes, the trainers. But what connects all these other cults is that in every case, they would be on the end of what you might call the destructive cult spectrum. In other words, their followers either committed assaults or violence, murders, in the case of the Manson family and the Om Shinrikyo, or the Branch Davidians, of course, went down in a blaze of glory, fighting with the ATF and the FBI in Waco, Texas, at their compound, whereas the other ones committed, mass suicide. And so this is at the end of the spectrum of what might be called a destructive cult. But really, every cult, I'm convinced it is destructive. Whether or not you're actually murdering people or committing mass suicide, the cults can be very destructive relationally, personally, religious trauma syndrome, those kind of things can be very destructive. Or, for example, the Jehovah's Witnesses cults, they have a policy whereby you can't receive a blood transfusion. And countless numbers of people have died because of their religious philosophy that you can't have blood transfusion. So on that level, I would argue that Jehovah's Witnesses are a destructive cult. So you can sort of place cults on that spectrum, that continuum. Some are less destructive than others, but they're all destructive on some level. So this is a common misconception. Here's a guy that's looking at a cult member and says, hey, look, people who join cults, they're just stupid. That's what it is. They're gullible fools. They don't know any better. Anyone who falls for brainwashing tactics is nothing more than an idiot. I am far too smart ever to join a cult. A lot of people say that. A lot of people think that it's all about stupidity. You're stupid, you're gullible, you're a fool to get sucked into the cult. Now, do you agree with that? And this question is why or why not? Do you think that it's about whether or not you're smart enough to avoid being sucked into a cult, or it's about stupid people, getting pulled in? Anyone have any thoughts?
And Michael says not at all.
Mhm.
Mhm.
I think it's people looking for community and a
Yeah.
relationship.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's
Agreed.
true. There's so much to it. The fact is, yeah, as we're going to see in a minute, it's not about stupidity or gullibility, or being an idiot or being too smart just to join a cult. As we'll see, there's so many different types of cults. You could say, I won't ever join a religious cult, but you could get sucked into a completely different type of cult. All right.
Brendan has raised his hand.
Oh, right. Who can see the transcript? I'm not sure what he's asking about.
Oh, sorry. If it's too late to comment, I can.
No,
Lower my
go
hand.
ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say that cults kind of remind me a little bit of like dictatorships, and why people say, "Oh, I wouldn't have supported that dictator," or so. But if people were like put in those circumstances at the time of a certain tyrant or dictator, they no matter how smart or educated they are, they tend to fall for it too. So I feel like it's kind of the same as
Yeah.
cults.
It's not about education or smarts, as it were. There's a lot of reasons why people join a cult. So this is the question: what kind of person joins a cult? What we find is that most people don't just join, in air quotes, they don't just join a cult, they are recruited in to the cult. Or like me or many others, they're born into it. I was born into it. I had no choice. I believed everything they taught us from day one. I was in a cult, but I didn't even know it. So there's second and third generation people or more generational people who are in long-term cults that are born into it. But the fact is, most people get recruited in to the cult. It doesn't just happen. I mean, most people don't say, I'm going to join a cult. I'm going to join a group where they're going to take all my money. I'm going to work, stupid, crazy hours. I'm going to be abused and maybe molested. And at the end of it all, kicked out of the group with nothing to show for it. You know what? That sounds fantastic. That's never what you're told at the beginning, but that's what happens, And the truth is, it's about vulnerability. The cult recruiters are looking for vulnerable people. It's not about stupidity or gullibility. It's more about tapping into what sorts of things motivate you that they can hook you in and pull you into the group. They'll find something that you think you need or you do need and pull you into the group. And that's typically how it happens. What we find is there's a lot of tactics that cults tend to use. You've heard of the love bombing tactic. That's one of the things where you come in, you visit the group maybe for the first couple times, and they just love on you. And I've seen this so many times in churches. We have to welcome the visitor. We want to make them feel so welcome, so comfortable. Everyone gathers around. We invite them out to lunch after church. And it's such a wonderful, loving environment. And it's just amazing. I talked to a woman one time. She was actually born and raised in Poland. She got recruited into the Jehovah's Witnesses as a young girl, coming out of a very dysfunctional family background. She went along to a Jehovah's Witness church service, and they just loved on her so much. And it was all seemingly so real. She thought, this is amazing. And it was amazing. And that's what pulled her into the group initially. She wasn't getting that at home, and she was getting it at the Jehovah's Witnesses, church. Another tactic they use is deception. So oftentimes what cults will do, they'll conceal their true beliefs. They will not tell you what they actually believe. And of course, the classic study is Xenu. This is what Scientologists actually believe. They don't tell you about Xenu on day one. When you walk into a Scientology center for a free personality test or free counseling, they don't tell you about Xenu and blowing up volcanoes and thetans floating around in the atmosphere and inhabiting your body. And none of that is told to you until you're well into the cult. So they will not tell you the whole story. They present a veneer of what it seemingly is all about, and it's very attractive. And I think another final tactic is that they're so sincere. They believe it. You can become an insider. And it's all about this us versus them sort of mentality, whereby we're going to change the world. We're going to save the world. You can be a part of that. We are doing something so important. You need to be a part of this thing, and you can become one of us. And we believe it. We all believe it, and it's a social structure whereby you get sucked into this thing. And it becomes about like a group think. This is something. What?
Sorry, Glenn, Andrea had a question.
Oh, right, go ahead.
Hi there. Yes, I've talked to Judy about this, but I got bored one day and had nothing to do, so I decided to join a group that I thought was going to really help me, and it was things like how to understand people. That was one. How to move on from a terrible situation and that kind of thing. So I'm listening to the first part of it, and it just sounds wonderful. And then at the end of the first part, he holds up a book, L. Ron Hubbard.
Yeah.
And so
Dianetics.
and so I started interrupting because the next speaker was coming on. But I said, no, I got to ask you a question. I have to ask you a question. Are you Scientologist? And they knocked me off.
Yeah, you're out of here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've been recruited into Amway, which is another business type of cult, and they straight up lied to me. My neighbor, when we were in Bible college, Andy and I went to the same Bible college in Portland, Oregon. Our neighbor got into Amway, and I said, when he started giving me the pitch, I said, wait a minute, is this Amway? He said, no, it's not. And it was, it absolutely was. He straight up lied to me. So the deception tactics are what cults use to suck you in. Now, I thought this is a really interesting quote from Stephen Hassan about how people get pulled into cults and what happens when they get in. He says, once recruits have bought into all the initial promises and hype, we're going to change the world, you're going to do all these amazing things, then it's about being incrementally introduced into a systematic method of control, one small step at a time. It doesn't happen overnight. It might take weeks, months, years, decades, and then the cult member gets sucked in. He says this methodical system of control, what he calls undue influence, disrupts the person's authentic identity and reconstructs a new identity in the image of the group or the leader. And this is exactly what happens. You begin to, it's all about social control, social compliance. To fit into the group, you actually sort of take on that religious self, that cult self, and you suppress your authentic identity, and you begin to do it so you can fit in. And this is what happens pretty soon. Before you know it, you're dancing to the strings of the leader or the group's theology or belief system or practices or whatever it might be. Then he goes on to say, in the process, an individual's ability to think rationally and act independently is undermined, enslaving even the brightest, educated, and most functional people. And if you know what this picture is, anyone know what that is a picture of?
Isn't that the Nexium or I can't remember his name,
Yeah.
thing?
So
That's
what? Yeah, that's the Nexium cult. Keith Raniere was the leader of that cult. He's now in prison, but still leading the cult, I think, from his prison cell. But a group of women were branded in their pelvic area, and it turns out it's actually Keith Raniere's initials. It's a K with an R, but they were kind of his sex slaves. But the thing about Nexium is that it attracted some of the most well-educated, motivated, bright, smartest, sharpest people. And that was the point, because they saw it as a way to advance their careers and advance their lives professionally and personally. So it wasn't about being stupid or gullible or being an idiot. In this case, Nexium attracted some of the most well-educated, brightest, smartest people there were. And that was the hook. You want to advance your career, this guy can help you because he's so smart. He's got it all figured out. So that kind of dispels that myth of, gullibility or stupidity. So how do you define a cult? There's a lot of different definitions. People call them new religious movements, and there's a lot of other possible definitions, but I like this one from Dr. Janja Lalich, who's a cult expert and herself a former cult survivor. And she says the cults are complex social organizations that are structured so as to institutionalize social controls and social influences that tend to benefit the group and or the leader. It's a social construct. When you join into it, and like I say, you begin to notice the way other people in the group are acting, and you begin to take on their characteristics, and it ends up benefiting the group or the leader. Now, if anyone remembers this, this was a scenario from one of my home states. Anyone remember what this picture is from?
One of those Eastern.
Antelope.
Yeah.
Those,
Yeah.
Antelope in Oregon?
those are the
Yeah.
people. Antelope.
Yeah, that was,
Yeah, in Oregon.
Yeah,
it
those
was-
are
that's the.
those are the
Bygone-
people. Those are the people that put cyanide, I think, in the
Yeah.
food
at the
bar
s- Yeah,
at
a couple,
Yeah,
restaurant.
yeah,
in
yeah.
town, trying to kill off the
yeah,
people.
they tried to
that-
poison, yeah. So,
Yeah, I
yeah,
think the Leader's O show, wasn't it?
yeah. There's a documentary on Netflix. I think it's called Wild Wild Country. It's about a 2
Yeah.
or 3 part. It's really fascinating, and it goes into the whole Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh cult that was in Antelope, Oregon. They basically took over a small town there, and talking about how it benefited him personally. He had something like over 36 Rolls Royces. He was making so much money off of his followers, and yet when he would drive or he would be driven down the roads, you can see these rabid cult followers would just run after him, and so they were worshiping him, and they're all wearing the same color of clothing. So again, it's a social structure, it's a social complex thing whereby it all somehow flows up to the cult leader. And this is a good example. This is from Stephen Hassan's bite model of cults. The way cults tend to be structured is like a pyramid. At the top, you have the leader or the leaders. Underneath them, you typically have a small, sort of a loyal group of lieutenants, sycophants. And you saw this in Nexium, for example. The sub-leaders under Keith Raniere, they were the ones pulling in women to be his sex slaves. These were the women that ended up being branded. Underneath them, you have a smaller group of real hardcore core devotees. Underneath them is the bigger group of the rank and file members, with, of course, your fringe members on the outside. And I think you can also reverse this too, because as the cult recruits new people from the outside, the aim is to go up the pyramid. The aim is to get as close as you can to the leader. You want to climb the pyramid, as it were, to get to the top. You may never actually meet the leader in person. The only time you may see him or her is when they're driving by in their Rolls Royce or something, but you're always trying to get there. And these people are stopping you from getting to the top. So, and of course, money flows in as well from the outside up to the top, which benefits the leader and the leadership at the top. The interesting thing too, I think, about cults is that a lot of cults have still continued on even though the leader has died. So of course, Joseph Smith of Mormonism, he's long dead, but yet Mormonism continues on. L. Ron Hubbard's dead, but David Miscavige is at the top of that cult. Jehovah's Witnesses, Charles Taze Russell's long since dead. That cult continues on. So just because a cult leader dies, the cult doesn't necessarily fall apart. It can stay on with a new leader at the top of the pyramid. And I found this interesting from Robert J. Lifton, who's an expert on cult psychology. He says basically almost every cult or group with undue influence exhibits these three following features. Number one, you have a charismatic leader. You have to have some sort of a guru figure, a messianic figure, someone who's got all the answers. If anyone knows who this is a guy, he goes by the name of Vissarion. Does anyone know where this picture is taken? Have you heard of Vissarion?
No.
Yeah, isn't it in Russia?
Yeah, he had a cult compound in Siberia with several thousand adherents that lived there. He also has several 100,000 followers around the world. They call the Church of the Last Testament, and he claims that he is the sort of living incarnation of Jesus Christ. And he was arrested just a couple of years ago by the Russian state, and as far as I know, he's still in prison. I think they were threatened by him because he was getting too much of a populist movement, and so they arrested him on some kind of trumped up charges. But here's the classic case of this guy couldn't be more of a messianic figure than if you tried. He's the incarnation of Jesus. He's got a cult, and he's got all these thousands of devoted adherents, hanging on his every word. And then, of course, what we have, the second tactic or the feature is what he calls coercive persuasion, thought reform, mind control, or some form of undue influence over its members. And there's that spectrum. Some cults are more destructive than others. Some cults are actually committing violence, but other cults just may do damage relationally, or you may be abused in the cult financially or in other ways. And then the third characteristic is there's an exploitation of members by the cult leader or the leadership. And what you find is it's either for sex or power or money or all three. That's what every cult pretty much, there's some combination or all three of those factors involved. Here's another example. Did anyone remember this guy, Father Yod? Ever heard of him? The Source family? I mean, there's your classic guru messianic figure. He ran a cult out of Southern California back in the 1970s. So he was making incredible amounts of money. He was kind of a pioneer in the health food industry. He had a health food restaurant in Southern California that was pulling in some $10,000 a day at its height, and that was in 1970s dollars. He had 14 wives, he had children. So of course he had the sex thing, and of course he was running this cults, and he was in control, so he had power as well. So here's Father Yo, he ticks all three boxes: money, power, and sex. And that's just sort of the typical cult leader. Kind of a funny story how if you know the story of how Father Yo died, they sold everything and moved to Hawaii. He was going to start a new compound over there, and he decided he was going to get into hang gliding, even though he'd never done any hang gliding in his life ever. He'd never had lessons or anything. He bought a hang glider and jumped off of a 1,300 foot high cliff and plunged to his death. So that was the end of Father Yod. So, his ego literally got the best of him in the end. Now, when we get into the actual cult psychology, the cult tactics, there's a couple of models we can look at. We'll look at Stephen Hassan's, what he calls the bite model. And this is now when you're getting a person's actually gotten into a cult. How do cults control their members? How do they get to the point where they have such undue influence? And he has a model. It's an acronym, BITE. So we'll look at the B. The B stands for behavior control. So in the cult, what happens is the cult or the leader dictates every aspect of the adherents' lives. We're talking about clothing, hairstyles, with whom they can associate. Major time is spent on group indoctrination in a reward and punishment scenario. It just discourages individualism, promotes groupthink. And I put this picture up. I mean, this is a classic example of everything that we're talking about. Does anyone know what picture this is from? What cult and who's the leader of it?
The fundamentalists, Mormons.
Yeah, that's the FLDS. Who's the leader's name? Do we know who the leader's name is?
David Warren.
Not David Warren. No, it's Warren Jeffs.
Warren Jeffs.
Warren Jeffs. Yeah, there's a documentary now out on Netflix about the FLDS as well, which is fascinating because these women, I mean, hairstyles. You can see the picture. They all have to have exactly the same hairstyle. They all wear the same types and colors of dresses. They're all in an insular compound, and every aspect of their lives is controlled. And Warren Jeffs has absolute authority over all the cult members. If you step out of line, he can come down and he'll take away your family. There's been many examples of Warren Jeffs coming in and taking wives from a particular man and just giving them to another man. And they can do nothing about it, so because he holds the key to salvation. So they don't ever question the cult leader. So he's in ultimate charge of their behavior as well. And then you have information control. This is a classic cult tactic. Cults will withhold information. They'll systematically lie to members. We've seen that in the case of Scientology. They'll minimize or discourage access to non-cult sources of information, such as the internet, television, mobile phones, books, or articles. They're only going to promote cult-generated sources of information. They do not want you getting on websites to hear about how your group that you're in might be misleading them, lying to you, whatever. They're going to cut off your access to information and only promote what they want you to see, hear, and read. And then another aspect, the T in the model, is thought control. What happens is members internalize the group's doctrine as sole truth. It's very much a black and white Manichaean type of thinking. That's that us versus them mentality. Once you get people thinking that it's us versus the world, then you're thinking, okay, they're the enemy. It produces altered mental states. So chanting, meditation, singing, speaking in tongues. There's a rejection of critical thinking, analysis, or constructive criticism. And you think about a group like this. This is a picture of some Hare Krishnas in New York in Central Park. And I found it interesting because reading through Hassan's book, Combating Cult Mind Control, he gives an example of where he tried to deprogram a Hare Krishna devotee. And as he went out walking with him, every time he started to push this guy into some of the inconsistencies of their belief system and some of the problems within the group, the guy just would start chanting. into mantras. And it was just this thought stopping tactic. Just start chanting. I don't want to hear it. I'm going to start chanting. And this is an example of cult thought control. And then finally, the E stands for emotional control. So what happens is the cult manipulates and narrows your range of feelings. Some emotions are classed as wrong or evil. And here, where you have thought stopping techniques, now you have emotion stopping techniques, promoting feelings of guilt or unworthiness. And again, instilling the fear of the outside world of being shunned by the group. There's never any legitimate reason for you to leave. And cults will threaten you. They'll say, look, if you question things, if you think too much about what we're teaching you or practices, you'll get kicked out. And they will often use other people as examples who have been kicked out. So you don't want what happened to her to happen to you. So we'll do that to you. And so there's never any reason to leave. And we see this. I thought this was an interesting thing because this is what's going on now. Liz Cheney has been shunned in the cult of Trump, the cult of the big lie, formerly known as the Republican Party. Be gone, heretic, and that's exactly what it is. There's this fear of shunning. If you turn against Trump, he and his acolytes will shun you. They'll kick you out. Now, this is what I find interesting. You think, okay, there's only like religious cults. That's the only kind of cults there are. But I think this gives us a good spectrum of the range of the types of cults that there are out there and the dangers that cults can pose. Like I was saying earlier, you might actually get sucked in, maybe not into a religious cult, but there's so many other different kind of cults out there that can pull people in, or they can be cultish, as Amanda Montell says. So this is from Janja Lalich's book, Take Back Your Life. So of course you've got your Eastern cults. I don't know if you've heard of the Buddhafield cult. There's another documentary on Buddhafield that's really interesting. Of course, we saw Om Shinrikyo, the cult that poisoned the sarin gas attack in the Tokyo subways, Transcendental Meditation, those kind of cults. Then you have religious cults. These are the classic ones: Mormonism, Fundamentalist Latter-day Saints. We saw Warren Jeffs, the Jehovah's Witnesses, the Bible cults of all sorts, independent fundamentalist Baptist churches. Stephen Jackson or somebody. These guys are very serious cults, fundamentalist Bible cults. And then, of course, you can have political, racist, or terrorist cults. I think Brendan was mentioning this. What we're seeing now over the last several years in America, the cult of Trump. And Stephen Hassan's written a book on the cult of Trump. What we see in North Korea, that is a political cult of personality. Hitler, Stalin, Mussolini, the KKK. And you think of these kind of pictures, here's two men who ran in Italy and Germany, political cults of personality. They were absolutely worshipped by the populace of their countries for many, many years. And of course, now in North Korea, Kim Jong-un has got, and his father before him, ran the entire country as a political cult of personality. And he's loved by all the people and all the rest of it. Of course, it's a horrible, despotic, terrible regime to live in. But of course, that's not the face this is the face of the country that they show to the outside world. Everybody loves Kim Jong-un. Another kind of cults, psychotherapy, human potential, or mass transformational cults. We see cults that have gurus, yoga coaches, life coaches as leaders. NXIVM, I think, would fit into this. Rajneeshpuram, it was about your human potential, what you could achieve. And that was the appeal of cults like NXIVM. Then there's a completely different type of the business cults, commercial, multi-level marketing cults. I've talked about being recruited into Amway. There's essential oil cults. There's all kinds of business cults. A lot of people would class Scientology as a commercial cult because it's actually a money-making scam. That's what Scientology really is all about. It's about getting the people in and getting them on what they call the bridge, which is you pay money to get audited. And it costs more and more and more and more money. The longer you go into it, you're supposed to be getting clear, getting rid of all the thetans in your body, but actually it's a money-making system, and it's a rewarding thing that way. PSO cults, pressure sales organization cults like Amway. These are examples of multi-level MLM type cults. And then, of course, you've got your New Age cults, Happy Science, Realism, Agama, John of God down in South America. A couple more occult, satanic, or black magic cults. there's a lot of disputes on this one because, I mean, there have been, the Brotherhood of the Golden Arrow was a 19th century satanic cult. But then you had the Satanic Panic. If anyone lived through that in the 1980s, I lived through it as an evangelical. That was all started from a book called Michelle Remembers. And supposedly there was all these satanic cults of pedophiles and child killers across America. And none of it was true. So you have to be very careful as far as filtering the truth from the lies out there. And then the last one-on-one, or what you might call the family cults. I would say the IBLP, Bill Gothard's Institute in Basic Life Principles. Every family becomes a miniature little cult. The therapist-client type cult, or the Family International. One more is cults of personality. And into this you have like martial arts cults, CrossFit, Peloton, art, medicine, healing type cults. So what could happen is, for example, anyone remember this story? You know who these two people are? This is going way back to the 70s. Who's the guy? The guy on the left was hugely famous at the time. That guy on the left with the beard, that's Brian Wilson from the Beach Boys. And the guy on his shoulder is a guy named Eugene Landy. If you remember this story, Brian Wilson had a nervous breakdown and he couldn't function anymore as a member of the Beach Boys. And they got this psychotherapist, this Eugene Landy, to come in, and he advocated this practice called 24-hour therapy. But in the end, he ended up totally controlling Brian Wilson's life for years. And then they finally succeeded in getting rid of him. And then he came back. He was paying Landy $20,000 a month in the 80s. I mean, that's crazy money even now. And he totally controlled Brian Wilson's life. Another example is the Peloton, the CrossFit cult. This is a weird thing that Amanda Montel talks about, that these gyms, these workout places can actually become cults centered around that particular leader. People follow that person who's on a CrossFit bike or a Peloton bike or Soul Cycle bike, and they begin to buy all the same clothes from the same manufacturers, and the person becomes a celebrity and a rock star. They begin to abuse the followers' lives, and that becomes a little cult in and of itself. So anything, is what I'm saying, can become cultish or cult-like. Even if you think I'm just going to go work out down at the CrossFit or whatever, or Soul Cycle, you might get sucked into a cult of personality, or you might go to see a therapist and slowly get indoctrinated into his or her one-on-one cult. Just two people is all it takes, and you can be controlled by this person. A couple of last things before I wrap it up. This is something I found really fascinating from Dr. Robert J. Lifton. He wrote the book Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism, based on studying ex-Korean War prisoners who had been brainwashed in China, communist Chinese prisons. And he came up with 8 sort of classic characteristics or tactics that cults use that show how they actually suck people in. And I think of it kind of as a spectrum. It starts at the beginning and works its way through to the end. So he talks about the first aspect of cults is what he calls milieu control. And the group here and the leader controls all the information as well as the total environment, and often results in doubling to fit in. This is what Stephen Hassan was talking about, in the sense that you begin to take on the sort of religious personality, you suppress your authentic self, and you take on the veneer of the group. And that's this doubling process. You replace your authentic personality with the cultic one or the religious one. And in this process, the second aspect is what he calls mystical manipulation, what Lifton calls planned spontaneity, the psychology of the pawn. So when you come into a service, it seems really spontaneous, but it's actually carefully planned. And you think about, this is something that if you come out of evangelicalism, like myself and Andy, we used to lead worship. We used to play in worship bands, and we would draw people into an experience, and it was supposed to be an experience of God. And you're worshiping in this church, and it's amazing, and it is an emotional journey. But the fact is, it's all carefully choreographed. The song selection, the types of songs that we would put in the worship set, the lighting, the mood. We would start off with a fast couple of songs to get people excited. Then we'd bring it down and more contemplative songs. And people would say, I had an amazing experience of God this morning. But actually, it was all carefully planned It was the psychology of the pawn. And that's all mystical manipulation, as Lipton would see it. And then when you get into the group, what happens is there's what's called the demand for purity. As you get into it, the group or the leader starts to place unrealistically high standards on the adherents. The problem is you can't ever meet them. You are going to fail. You will fail. And in evangelicalism, this is the purity culture around, let's say, sex. You're not ever going to have sex before your marriage, or you're not going to have an affair. And of course, teens can't meet that. They can't do it, and so they're going to fail. And so you can't possibly please God or the cult leader or whatever. When that happens, that leads to the next aspect, which is what he calls a cult of confession. So when you sin, when you go to do the wrong thing, you then have to confess it. And that begins to enforce conformity through guilt, through shame, confession. It leads both to self and mutual criticism in small groups. And again, I couldn't help but think of when I was an evangelical, we had small groups, and we would all sit around with our Bibles and we would confess our sins and areas where we had failed each other and areas where we'd failed God. And we would read the Bible, we'd pray for each other, we'd hold each other accountable. But this was all part of the demand for purity and the cult of confession. Of course, I didn't see it at the time. That was what was going on. And the last four things are sacred science. So in the cult, in the group, there's the elevation of the group or leader's sacred text such that it cannot be questioned. It gives the group legitimacy. For example, the Book of Mormon. That gives the Mormon religion a sense of legitimacy. We've got this sacred book. Joseph Smith translated it from the golden plates that he found, and it was the angel Moroni, and it was this whole story of Jews living in South America. You don't question it. And that's the basis of the Mormon faith. You can't question it. Some other sacred science books, of course, the Bible. You cannot question the Bible. It's inspired, it's inerrant, it's infallible, it's without mistakes, it's without error. It's the Word of God. If you question it, you'll be labeled a troublemaker. And of course, somebody mentioned Dianetics. This is the foundation of Scientology. You don't question LRH tech, as they say. Another example of sacred science is, of course, the basis of Christian Science. Mary Baker Eddy, Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures. So these are just a few examples of sacred science within various cults and religions. Last couple of things he talks about loaded language. And what happens as you get into the cult, there's jargon. It's insider talk that only the adherents, only the followers know. We know what it is, we use it, and we understand it. It's an us versus them dynamic. It's a thought terminating cliche. And I think, again, those of you that came out of evangelicalism, I can't help but relate it to my own experience. This is a classic case of what's called Christianese. So we used to use this in churches, and these are just a few examples of phrases, platitudes, bromides, loaded language that Christians use that only Christians know. It's just insider jargon, and if you don't know what it is, it's all babbling. But the fact is that when I saw what this was, I was like, oh my God, that's Christianese. That's loaded language. Scientologists have all kinds of buzzwords they use. They talk about SPs, disconnecting. They've got all sorts of acronyms and buzzwords. These are all loaded language. And as soon as you challenge them, they'll start quoting thought terminating cliches, and that sort of limits their critical thinking. Last couple things is doctrine over person. So what happens in a cult, the group or the leader's doctrine begins to take precedence over personal relationships within the group. So any contradiction that I might see in the teaching, I'm going to feel guilty about that. If I doubt it, it means I am evil, I am deficient. And I've seen this in so many cases in evangelicalism and Christianity where people will sacrifice a personal relationship with another Christian over being, quote, right, following what the Bible says or what the pastor says. And it doesn't matter if you've hurt that other person. My doctrine takes precedence over your person and in our personal relationship. I don't care because I'm right. And I don't care if you're hurt. And that's a case of doctrine over person. And then the last element of this is what he calls the dispensing of his existence. So when you come to the back end, anyone who breaks the rules, anyone who questions things, they're now seen as tainted. They have not seen the light anymore. Now they lack the right to exist. What happens here? They're oftentimes cut off from the group. They're shunned, excommunicated, church discipline in the Christian church. Scientology will disconnect you Jehovah's Witnesses will disfellowship you. So every group has its way to shun or disconnect or dispense with your existence. And that is sort of on the back end. And you can be cut off from all your friends, family, all relationships. I thought this is kind of funny. Anyone who comes out of Christianity, keep your congregation squeaky clean with new improved shunning. That's how they do it, though. I just read a book. I'm reading a book now by a good friend of mine, Dave Warnock. I don't know if anyone's familiar with his work, but he wrote a book called Childish Things, and he was a pastor for 30 some years, evangelical, and he was shunned, excommunicated. His own family turned against him. He lost all the relationship with his daughters and son, and he ended up losing his marriage over the fact that he became an atheist. And they cut him off. They said, we will no longer have anything to do with you. And he has no relationship with his family. So that's an example of even a loving church shunning and cutting you off. All right, last couple of things, and then we can open it up for dialogue. What do you do if a friend or a loved one gets sucked into a cult? This is the classic one. Back when the Children of God started, they were going on a bus across America, witnessing, singing, praying. They were amazing, wonderful bunch of hippies, and people were getting saved, and it seemed like a wonderful thing. What would you do if your friend said, or a family member said, hey, I'm getting on a bus, I'm going to evangelize the world? What do you do? And the classic thing is, I don't know if you remember this, there's an episode of The Simpsons where a cult sets up shop outside of Springfield, and Marge gets sucked into it, and then later Homer and the kids get sucked into it. And at one point, they need to deprogram them. Marge escapes, and they go into a field in a car, and Reverend Lovejoy and groundskeeper Willie pull Homer and the kids out. They're still dressed in their cult garb here, and they're hitting them over the head with baseball bats, and they go deprogram them. You think that's the answer? I'll go kidnap this person. I'll pull them out. That's the classic sort of cult deprogramming thing. Well, that's actually not as good a way to go. Actually, the best thing you can do is to keep in touch as much as you possibly can. This is a good piece of advice. Some cults you can't. If they might be living on a compound and have all the access to information cut off from them, you can't. But if you can keep in touch with them, you need to keep that personal relationship. Remind them that you still care about them, you still love them, you want to stay in touch with them as much as you can, see them as much as you possibly can, or as much as you're allowed to. That's one thing to do, is to stay in touch. And then I think it's really good not to get into a direct argument, direct confrontation. When you do see the person, you might only see them once every few years if they're only allowed to visit friends and family every so often. The worst thing you can do is get into a fight and argue with them. That's going to be counterproductive, because they're going to go into thought-stopping, thought-loaded language, thought-terminating cliches. You're not going to get, they've been brainwashed. They've been indoctrinated into the cult. You're not going to get anywhere with direct confrontation. And as we see now, actually kidnapping or forcible deprogramming, it's actually illegal. You can't just grab people. If anyone remembers a guy, he was named Ted Patrick. He's an African-American guy, and he got in trouble back in the 80s. And this is what he used to do. He would physically grab people. And this is the story from Salt Lake City, where a guy was in I guess he was in the Hare Krishna, and he actually grabbed this guy out of a car, threw him in a van, and sped off with him, and tried to deprogram in another location. Well, off the back of this kidnapping, basically Ted Patrick ended up going to jail over it. So you can't kidnap people. You can't throw them in the back of a van and deprogram them. That used to be the way it was done, but you can't do that anymore. Now, you can, though, seek the help of a cult expert. However, you have to be aware it can be very, very expensive. I mean, Rick Allen Ross, Stephen Hassan, they still do cult interventions, but they are going to charge you a lot of money to cover their expenses. So that's one lifeline, but it could be quite expensive. The last thing, this is what Rick Allen Ross talks about in his book, is that if you can talk to the cult member, rather than confronting them with their flaws in their logic or their theology or their whatever their group is doing, you can focus on general cult tactics. You can say, let's talk about what cults do. Let me describe for you cult tactics and see what you think of. What would you say about a group that did this, this, and this? what would you think? And a lot of times they'll say, well, that's a cult, and you can say, right. So it's indirect. You're saying, does your group exhibit any of those characteristics rather than attacking their group or their leader? And something that Rick Ross said I thought was interesting. He says, through deprogramming or cult intervention, the only issues that are addressed focus upon the specific group and group involvement. You can talk about those generalities. The subject of such an intervention subsequently may leave the group and go on with their life, reassuming their own basic individual values and beliefs. There have been examples of people leaving cults. It's very, very difficult to get somebody out. All right, last thing I was going to talk about, and we'll end it. Some tips for ex-cult recovery. If you've come out of a group or a high control cult or group, what are some tips for recovery? See, the things I've found personally helpful to myself. First of all, education. So reading, researching books, articles on how we were manipulated, how we were controlled, how we were abused by the group. It's empowering because what happens is you start to name the tactics that were used on you. And you can say, right, that's what they did to me. And that's how it affected me. And that starts to disempower their tactics and it empowers you. So education is a critical piece of the sort of reconstruction, recovery aspect. And then a lot of people have gotten therapy or counseling. What you need is to find a licensed therapist who understands trauma. And I think specifically religious trauma syndrome. And this is something I've done a lot of talking with people like Marlene Winnell, Mike Phillips, who is a therapist out of Sacramento, California. They use EMDR and internal family systems therapy, which has been massively helpful rather than cognitive behavior therapy, which tends to just bring up the trauma again and again and again. So EMDR is a very helpful therapy technique we have found for people with religious trauma syndrome. And then another helpful tip is to find a supportive community. There's a lot of ex-cult groups. You'll find them on Facebook. You go on Twitter, look for certain hashtags. Joining one of these groups on Facebook or other social media is massively helpful. For example, there's ex-evangelical groups on Facebook. I was a part of one for a long time. I've got a group that I have for my podcast. That's a supportive community. A lot of people in the group have come out of religion. So that's a hugely helpful thing. We need community. And then the other aspect of it is this process of finding or recovering our authentic self. So what happened is in the cult, our experience of doubling, taking on that religious persona, we suppressed our authentic self. We got to find or recover that authentic self. So that's part of the journey. And then, of course, I can't say I got to put a shameless plug in my podcast. I've done a lot of episodes with ex-cult members, cult experts, therapists. The Cult Vault podcast, my friend Chris Shelton, Sensibly Speaking podcast. He's an ex-Scientologist. He's done a lot of stuff on Scientology. There's so many podcasts out there on the topic of cults and ex-cult recovery. So there's a lot of resources out there as well as good books. I'll give you quick examples of some resources. Stephen Hassan's book, Combating Cult Mind Control, is a good one. Janja Lalich and Madeline Tobias, Take Back Your Life, Recovering from Cults and Abusive Relationships. Another one by Janja Lalich, Escaping Utopia, Growing Up in a Cult, Getting Out and Starting Over. That's a fantastic book. If, like me, you were raised in a cult. Robert J. Lifton, of course, is Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism, a study of brainwashing in China. That's where he lays out those 8 characteristics of cults. Rick Allen Ross, Cults Inside Out. A lot of examples of all kinds of different cults in that book, as well as how to get someone out of a cult. That's a really good resource. And then Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, The Body Keeps the Score, Brain, Mind, and the Body in the Healing of Trauma, probably the most foundational book on the healing of trauma. He doesn't get into religious trauma syndrome, but he talks about EMDR and IFS as really helpful techniques for treating trauma. And then Marlene Winnell's Leaving the Fold, the guide for former fundamentalists and others leaving their religion. Fantastic book on religious trauma syndrome. So those are just some good resources I've personally discovered that have helped me in my own recovery process. So I will now stop sharing the screen and we can, I guess, open it up for questions and some dialogue.
Thank you, Clint. That was most enlightening as always.
Whirlwind.
Yes.
Oh,
That's true.
man.
Brennan has his hand up.
Yeah, I
Um,
also would like to say thank you very much for the presentation. It was great and very interesting and insightful.
Mm,
I guess my question is,
yeah.
sometimes like a country or dictatorship can be a cult. What do you do if
Yeah.
you're actually stuck in like a country that's a cult? Like, do you try to escape or do you try to start a revolution against that cult, or what do you do? Like, what's the best way if you're actually literally stuck inside a cult?
That's the problem. I mean, what would you do if you're a North Korean?
Right,
You
there's
know,
not many options, so.
not many options. I mean, people do escape physically from North Korea, but they don't even. They're so indoctrinated in it because if you ever seen those documentaries on North Korea, they've allowed a little bit of access into the country to try to present it as normal and everything else. They've got children that have been indoctrinated for generations in their school programs, and they don't even know they're in a cult. You know, they're just, that's the way it is. They're worshiping Kim Jong-un. It's almost an impossible situation because you could get shot by trying to escape the country. You
I mean,
know?
there's some outside information that does get into North Korea, like through the illegal markets. I mean, is it possible that
Yeah.
some of them see past the propaganda and have kind of figured it out that it is like a cult and that
Oh,
are
yeah.
being lied to and stuff?
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's the problem, though. It's like any other, you know, Nazi Germany or some of those places. Anything you do to question the regime, you can end up in prison or being executed.
Right.
And this is something Lifton talks about in the dispensing of existence. The most extreme example of that was places like Nazi Germany. If you questioned Hitler, they would take you out and put a bullet in the back of your head. That is the ultimate dispensing of existence. They will literally kill you or throw you in prison. The first concentration camps in Germany were for political prisoners, Germans. They weren't for Jews and for Poles and Jehovah's Witnesses. They were for his own fellow Germans who were, quote, political prisoners that questioned Hitler's rise to power. You know, so that's how these cults work.
Thank you, Brennan, and thank you, Clint. Just in case you don't know, you can raise your hand in the reactions there's a little reaction button down there on the bottom of your screen. And if you click on that, there will be a thing about raising your hand. Mike.
Yeah, you're talking about, getting shot and all that. But I mean, really the worst thing that can happen, and this happens in our own culture. I mean, culture is by the very definition our cults. I mean, coming down here past a bunch of signs, America, love it or leave it. So, I mean, the biggest thing, you're talking about how to get out of these cults in these countries. The biggest problem is not so much getting shot, but it's being ostracized, like you were saying with the cults, where the atheist was cut off from his family. I mean, the same thing happens in countries.
Yeah.
You're all of a sudden, you're not a real North Korean, so you're cut off from, your friends, your family. They all shun you. You're a political dissident. You're backwards. You're ignorant. Same thing in America. You don't follow the right leader that you're supposed to be following. You can find yourself very quickly ostracized from your own community.
Well,
that much worse than getting shot. And
anyone now who speaks up against Trump's big lie and who's a Republican is getting ostracized. Liz Cheney, I just read some articles today about look what's going on in Arizona. The way to get ahead in the Republican Party today is to embrace and promote Trump's big lie about the rigged election and everything. And if you speak out against that, you are ostracized, and that's exactly what's going on. Trump is running and he has run a political cult of personality for years now. And you cannot speak up against the dear leader. You'll be ostracized. You'll lose your position in the Republican Party. And that's exactly the same tactic.
Yeah, but I mean, I'm talking even smaller scale than that. Say you live in a very conservative community and you're an open atheist. I mean, you got people whispering behind your back. Your neighbors are all of a sudden not so helpful to you.
Yeah.
You're the butt of the neighborhood gossip.
Yeah. Yeah, it happens. America's deeply polarized, isn't it? On the relational level. I mean, I've lost relationship with friends and family. I mean, I live over here in the UK, but obviously I'm active on social media. I've lost loads of friends on Facebook. I've unfriended or they've unfriended me that because I disagree with their political views. half my family doesn't speak to me anymore because I've gone atheist or whatever, so it happens.
Michael, was there anything else for you to bring up, Michael?
No, I mean, no, that's all for now. I got plenty I could bring up, but I don't want to.
Remember, members get a time alone with the speaker, so you will have some more time with them later.
Yeah.
Tom, where'd you go? Did I accidentally undo your hand? Tom, you had a question?
Yeah, I actually had a couple of questions. I'll start with one. So are there certain personality types or personality characteristics that are more likely to join cults? I was listening to your kind of the risk factors for joining cults. I was thinking, but are there just not so much intelligence, but just ways of interacting with the world that make you more vulnerable?
Well, I think the beautiful thing, well, I said beautiful thing about cult recruiting is how clever they are in finding that hook, finding whatever it is that is your particular vulnerability, and that's the key thing, is that they teach cult recruiters to find that vulnerability in whoever they're talking to. It could be money. I mean, I remember one time I was in Seattle, I was standing at a bank machine, an ATM machine, and a guy came up to me and he said, "You look awfully familiar. I swear I know you from somewhere." It was all bullshit. He didn't know me from Adam. The whole thing was designed to put me at ease. And the next thing I know, he was talking to me about how much money I earned at my job. Do you want to earn more money? And his hook was, if I had responded to that, he was trying to hook me into Amway. And it was all a front. None of it was true. He didn't know me. He probably said that to 20, 30 people a day. And that was his way to find a hook. If I'd have been responded to that, and I kind of realized, I'm like, this is Amway, isn't it? Oh, no, it's not Amway. We work with Fortune 500, blah, blah, blah. I said, bullshit. I know this is Amway. This is exactly what you're doing. And I got rid of him. But that was how clever the whole system was. They'll find a vulnerability and tap into it.
I had some friends who many years ago gave my wife and me an Amway pitch. And I got so upset that suddenly my kids had to go to bed at like 7 o'clock at night.
Find an excuse. Yeah.
Yeah. My other question was when you're describing, modern religious cults, it occurred to me that is it likely that most successful religions at their origins were cults? I wouldn't think of the Catholic Church today as a cult, but I would think of the early Christians as a form of cult because they were so counter to the prevailing culture and so insular.
Yes. I was just tweeting about this morning. Would Jesus himself be considered a cult leader if he were alive today? And I think it's, for example, Christianity, I think it's baked into the system. Because if someone came home and said, I've been following this religious teacher and he's told me to sell everything I had and give it to the poor and walk away from my business and my family, and he's going to come not with peace but a sword, and you have to hate your father, mother, brother, and sisters more than me to be my disciple, and I'm going on the road with them, and I'm going to be an adherent of this penniless guru. You think, what the hell? This guy, my
but that
brother,
presumes that the
he's a
gospel
cult.
writers' renditions of him, assuming that Jesus existed, as I said, represent the reality, right?
What I'm saying is that I think it's baked into the DNA of Christianity itself. Whether or not that actually happened, that dynamic, that pattern, it's right there, isn't it? And I think I've written articles on, is evangelicalism a cult? And I argue that it's too big of it's not a monolith. It's too big. It can't be considered a cult, but it has very, very many characteristics of cults. I've done episodes going through all 8 of those characteristics of Robert J. Lifton's and showing how evangelical churches use all 8 of them. And so to me, that makes many, many churches fit a cultic pattern when you can do that point by point by point. Maybe it's not a cult like some groups, but it's cultish, as Amanda Bontel would say, and it does a lot of damage. And that's the difference I was realizing when I was going through Dave Warnock's book. There comes a point for a lot of ex-evangelicals when they realize that not only am I not believing the theology in the Bible, I've actually come to a point where I see this religion as harmful. It's harmful. It does a lot of damage. It's done damage to me and to a lot of other people. And I think that's a tipping point where you go, actually, I'm speaking out against the damage that this religion does to people. And that's the cultic elements of it, I think, or can be.
Anything else, Tom?
Nope.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you, Clint. Jim, I'm gonna let you go. Remember, we're gonna have members have time alone with Clint later. So,
Yes, fascinating presentation. I wanted to ask you about your thoughts about the UFO cult. We haven't heard much about that recently, and I'm wondering if it's simply because the recent revelations coming from the James Webb Telescope showing the sheer enormity of space, and how unlikely it is that someone would travel all that distance just to probe our anal openings. It just doesn't seem rational, even to the most committed cultist.
Oh man!
But these are basically people who appear, to me at least, to share many of the same characteristics as the other species of cults that you outlined, especially the search for a savior, someone who will come along and show you.
Flat earthers, there's a lot of conspiracy theories as well. I mean, QAnon's another example. There's a question, is QAnon a cult? And I argue that it is in a lot of ways, but other than Q himself, whoever Q is, they don't have a visible leader. So who is Q? You know, so a group can develop the characteristics of a cult without even having a quote unquote leader. But yeah, you're right. I mean, UFO cults, that maybe that was a thing before the technology, as you say, kind of showed us, wait a minute, unless it's all a big conspiracy theory, unless you're a flat earther, maybe it's not, none of it's true. It's all a hoax. The Hubble telescope's it's all a hoax.
There are those too, still unbelievably flat earth advocates.
Yep, it's true.
thank you, Jim.
That's all. Thank you.
Linda?
Hello? I'm curious. I'm asking more about the people who are born into these extreme religious beliefs or whatever. And I have met in my humanist group time and time again, people who even as kids did not buy into the doctrine. And I'm wondering, you know, like, or people, let's say, who are born in North Korea, never buy into the political lines, you know? Or they snap out of it without any help from anybody. They just kind of figure it out. I wonder if their brain receptors are aligned differently than that of your average human being.
I don't know. I've come to see that what we call like first generation and second generation cultists, there is a definite difference. So I would consider myself a second generation in that I was born into it, as opposed to someone who joined a religion or a cult later in life and then left it, you know? So for me, a person who was born into it, it's a different journey because I never had an authentic self. You know what I mean? I never had that doubling experience that Lifton talks about because I only ever had the religious self. Whereas a person who had a self before they joined the group actually had an authentic self that they developed. And then that gets suppressed by the religious self. And then they have to go back and reclaim the self they had before they joined the group, you know. And what Marlene Winnell talks about in her book, Leaving the Fold, she says that when you're born into a cult or a fundamentalist group, when you have questions or doubts, you say, I'm not sure if I believe that, you know, like you were saying. She said, what's actually happening? That's your authentic self trying to assert itself. You're saying, this is bullshit. This is crazy. It doesn't make sense. You know, and that's examples of your authentic self trying to break through the sort of shell, that religious veneer. And for some of us, what happens is there's enough of those doubts, the cognitive dissonance gets to the point where we call it like putting things on the mental shelf in the back of our mind. Eventually, the weight becomes too much and the shelf collapses and you can't sustain it anymore. And you end up walking away. And that's what happens to a lot of people. But that shelf can hold a lot of weight.
Yeah, but some people, it's like they just never get into having that being brainwashed in the first place.
Yeah.
It's like they never believe it,
Or
even when they
yeah, they question
born
it from,
into it. How do they do
Yeah.
that?
well, yeah, it's like that authentic self never does get subsumed by the religious self, I think.
Yeah.
Because I've read books about people who never bought it and they got punished and punished and punished and punished. I talked to
Yeah.
one woman who was raised in the FLDS. She was actually married to Warren Jeffs. She was his 68th wife. When she was 18, she was forced to marry him, and she tried to escape numerous times out of the cult, and she kept getting caught and returned to the cult compound, and she was increasingly put in more restricted spaces. And she knew after the last escape attempt, if she got caught, they were going to put her somewhere where she would never going to be found again. She would never get out, on a compound in the middle of the country. And she actually unscrewed a screw in the window. They had the windows screwed shut so she couldn't escape. She found a broken pair of scissors in a closet, unscrewed the screws, opened the window, and got out and ran. And a neighbor saw her and got her away. And she never got caught again. But that's an example of what the links that a cult will go to keep you under control.
Yeah. But it's like, that's why I'm wondering if maybe
Linda,
the brain circuitry is there.
Linda, I'm
Okay.
sorry. I'm gonna have to cut you off, unless you can
Run
make
out of time.
it, because we have other people looking to ask questions.
Uh-huh.
Did you have something quick?
No, it's just, that's why I was thinking maybe it could be in the brain circuitry that some people are just naturally resistant.
Yeah, maybe.
Maybe.
They just have
Okay,
more of a
then.
stronger personality. I don't know.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Okay.
Linda.
Okay, let's get that. I'm trying to mute.
Brendan?
Yeah, so just a quick question. It might be kind of an unusual question, but what if someone actually finds themselves or comes to the realization that they are a cult leader? What should they do? Should they just tell everyone, sorry, this is a cult, I misinformed all of you, or what should they do?
A cult leader?
Yeah, like what should they do if they realize that they're a cult leader and they come to that realization, and what do they do next?
Have you ever heard of a cult leader apologizing for?
No?
I've never heard of it. That's the problem. A lot of people become cult leaders specifically for that reason, for money, sex, power, or some combination of three. I mean, even Warren Jeffs, he's in prison. Keith Raniere is in prison. They are still running their cults. They have never, ever apologized. They've never said they were sorry. They never said they were wrong. They've only doubled and tripled down. I can't think of a single cult leader who held up their hand and said, I was wrong about this. You need to, they go to their graves, saying that they are, the Messiah or whatever they are. I don't know, but they should, but it ain't going to happen because there's a certain profile of a cult leader, and they tend to be extremely narcissistic. And that's one of the characteristics that almost every cult leader exhibits, is extreme narcissistic personality. And so it attracts a certain kind of personality profile. And then they're never, ever going to give up that power and authority and money that they get when they get to the top.
Thank you, Brendan. Did that answer your question, or?
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Clint.
Yeah.
Mr. Reinhardt.
Oh, yeah, I just have one brief comment, and that is a thing I saw on the internet about how to determine, I think conclusively, the difference between a cult and a religion. And that is that in a cult, there is a person at the top who knows it's a scam. And in a religion, that person is dead.
Yeah.
Other than
Yeah.
that, seen one is seen them all.
That's the thing, isn't it? I remember researching the difference between a religion and a cult or whatever. And one of the things they said, if you look at most religions, it's structured as a hierarchy. You have, let's say, access to God or the divine. Then you have this class of priests or something like that. And then you have the populace underneath them. And as soon as you set that dynamic up, you need to go through the priest to get to God, as it were. And they have the rituals and all the knowledge that you need to get, forgiveness of sins or whatever they are promising you. That is a system that leads itself wide open to abuses, because they control what the populace, what the masses are doing, because they have that insider access to God, as it were. And that's been the case through almost every human religion, hasn't it? There's been abuses by the clergy class, the priestly class, because that it's set up that way.
Yeah. Thank you, Clint. Steph, I'm sorry. Steph, do you have a question?
I do. I'm not sure if you mentioned it in your presentation, but the act of repetition, whether it be, a mantra or a prayer, or, during the holidays, you say certain things, and the constant necessary element of repetition seems to be also very prominent, whether it's an extreme cult or a normal religious service. I wonder what you thought about the repetition aspect.
Yeah, in fact, some good friends of mine, Conway and Siegelman, they wrote the book Holy Terror. They wrote a book called Snapping, which came out right after the Jonestown Massacre in '79, I think it was. Their book came out right after that in 1979 or 1980. It's one of the foundational books on the cult phenomenon, because that was just kind of blown up in the United States in the '70s, wasn't it? And what they found, they did a study on this, and they found that they call it information disease. And it's actually, those grooves are imprinted on our brain. They really actually are. So repetition is one of the key tactics that cults and religious groups use: singing, worship, chanting, praying in tongues, liturgy. We chant these mantras over and over, and actually are imprinted in our brains. It's a physical, psychological thing that actually does happen. And they did a whole study on this. That is called information disease, and that's one of the tactics that cults use to imprint stuff on our brain. And religions, I would say, as well.
Did that answer your question, Steph?
Yes, it did. And it's kind of like when every time I sneeze, someone says, "Bless you." It's that repetition that reminds me, "Would you please stop saying that?"
Programmed response.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know. I know. My girlfriend says that every time I sneeze, and she's not religious at all. And then when she sneezes, she says, "How come we don't say God bless you?" I'm like, too much, man, too much. I can't do that. I just can't,
That's why
too many years of that.
Gesundheit means to your health. So.
Yeah.
I'd say dog bless you.
Yeah. I'll say that to her next time she sneezes.
There you go.
I say Gesundheit.
Yeah.
If you are pleased with our programs, please tap the like button and then subscribe to our channel. Don't forget the bell so you don't miss any notices of new material. We usually post new content every week. See our created playlists to discover events thus far this year, or to see a list of topics and speakers from our rapidly growing and diverse collection since 1992.